I'm Henry, 46 years old, and I used to think I had a handle on life, or at least a handle on my marriage. But everything came crashing down right there in a cramped little apartment on the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri. See, my wife, Marissa, thought it'd be clever to test my loyalty, or my resilience, or maybe just my patience. Her circle of friends, mostly divorced women with axes to grind, convinced her that pretending to have an affair would somehow jolt me into paying her more attention. They thought it was funny. Marissa even told them later, like some grand joke they were all in on, that I'd never see it coming. The thing is, she didn't just act secretive. No, she went full tilt, changed her phone password, stayed out late with vague excuses about work projects, wore makeup she hadn't bothered with in years. She even started carrying herself with that quiet guilt, the kind that makes a man's stomach knot. For weeks, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I'd sit up on the edge of the bed, trying to count the ways she could be unfaithful, wondering if I'd done something to deserve this slow dismantling of trust. I lost weight. My hands shook whenever she left the room. But here's the twist I didn't see coming. About 3 weeks into the charade, I stumbled onto something real. Something she hadn't planned. It wasn't the fake affair that ended us. It was the fact that while she was busy pretending to cheat, I found evidence that she was actually embezzling money from the local community garden project we both helped manage. She'd funneled thousands into a secret account, and when I confronted her, after the staged affair bit blew up, she crumbled, finally admitting she'd used the fake cheating story as a cover for her real crime. I packed a bag that night. Didn't yell, didn't throw accusations. I just left, moved into a tiny apartment over in Brentwood, barely big enough for my clothes and a cot. Filed for divorce the next day. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust, it was the sheer audacity. She thought I'd forgive her for trying to break me, just because the affair was fake. But the embezzlement, the lies, the cold-blooded manipulation, that was too much. I realized then that love isn't always the thing that breaks you. Sometimes, it's the slow erosion of respect. I spent the first week in that dingy apartment, just existing. Springfield wasn't a city for clean breaks. Every corner felt familiar, every street like a cruel reminder of what used to be. But I couldn't go back, not even to collect the rest of my things. Marissa texted, of course, frantic apologies, hollow explanations, pleas for forgiveness. I didn't reply. It wasn't about the messages. It was about the silence between them. In those long, sleepless nights, I caught myself wondering how I hadn't seen it sooner. The subtle shifts in her tone, the way she started avoiding eye contact when I asked about the finances. Looking back, there were signs everywhere. Like how she volunteered to handle the garden's books, even though numbers were never her thing. Or how she suddenly became the most attentive, generous member of the committee, charming everyone into blind trust. I told myself it was stress, or that she was just trying to feel important. I told myself a lot of things to avoid the truth. Here's the real kicker, though, the twist behind the twist. About a week after I left, I got a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, figuring it was just another debt collector or telemarketer. But curiosity got the better of me later that night, and when I played the message back, my blood turned to ice. It wasn't Marissa. It was a woman from the garden committee, her voice shaky and urgent. She said they'd discovered irregularities in the garden's finances, and someone else, not Marissa, had come forward claiming Marissa was actually covering for them. Turns out, Marissa wasn't the mastermind. She was the scapegoat. The real thief was a guy named Richard, some smooth-talking committee member who'd gotten too deep into gambling debts and used Marissa as a front. And she, ever the people pleaser, agreed to take the fall because she thought it'd protect her reputation, and, by extension, mine. So there I was, sitting in my tiny apartment, realizing that my wife's fake affair was just a smokescreen. Not for her own embezzlement, but for someone else's crime. The betrayal was still real, but the motives? They were more twisted than I could have imagined. I didn't know what to do with that revelation. Part of me felt vindicated. She wasn't the conniving embezzler I thought she was, but another part of me felt sick, because she still let me believe she was cheating. She still manipulated me into thinking she was betraying me in the worst way, just to cover for someone else's crimes. A few days later, I caved and answered her call. Her voice was raw, almost apologetic, though still tinged with that stubborn defiance I knew so well. She tried to explain how Richard had pressured her, how he'd threatened to expose her own small financial missteps if she didn't take the blame, how it all spiraled out of control, and how she thought that if I believed she was unfaithful, maybe I'd pull away, give her space to fix it, to keep me and the garden's reputation intact. I listened, leaning against the cracked wall of that apartment, phone hot against my ear, heart colder than I'd ever known it could be. I could almost picture her in our old kitchen, twisting a dish towel between her hands, trying to spin her way out of the web she'd woven. But all I could feel was this hollow, gnawing ache, a mix of pity and rage and bitter resignation. She wanted me to come back, to forget everything, to believe that she was only trying to protect me. And for one fleeting moment, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to run back to our home, to pretend this was just a mess we could clean up with enough effort and love. But then I remembered the sleepless nights, the weight loss, the isolation. I remembered the cold, hard truth of how she let me rot in self-doubt and pain to cover for someone else's mistakes. I told her no. After that call, I expected things to settle into a slow, painful silence. But it didn't. About a week later, I found an envelope slid under my apartment door. No return address, just my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single piece of paper, a photocopy of a bank transfer receipt, showing a 5-figure sum wired into Marissa's secret account. The sender's name? Richard. There it was in black and white. The pressure Marissa had talked about wasn't entirely fictional, but it also wasn't as innocent as she tried to paint it. Richard wasn't just using her as a cover. He was paying her off. Hush money. And whether she saw it that way or not, it proved that she'd accepted the role willingly. I sat there for a long time, that paper trembling in my hands, realizing how deep the betrayal really went. Not only had she let me spiral into heartbreak and paranoia, not only had she manipulated my love for her into a weapon, but she'd also cashed in on it. I wasn't just a pawn in a game. I was collateral in a transaction I hadn't even known existed. That night, I boxed up the few things I had in the apartment and drove to the next town over Lebanon. I needed space, needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with memories of her. I found a cheap motel with peeling paint and thin walls and checked in under a fake name. Just me, a worn duffel bag, and the crushing realization that the person I thought I loved had sold me out for cash. In Lebanon, I spent my days driving aimlessly down back roads, listening to old country songs on a radio that only half worked. At night, I sat in that cheap motel room, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together what parts of my life were real and would have been built on sand. I thought about the garden committee meetings Marissa and I used to attend, how she always brought homemade cookies and laughed at Richard's dumb jokes. I thought about how I'd ignored those little gut instincts, the way she flinched when he brushed her arm, the way she always downplayed his help with the finances. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up worrying she was cheating, not realizing the cheating was financial, not physical. And then came the letter. About 2 weeks after I'd holed up in that motel, I got a thick manila envelope at the front desk. Inside was a stack of legal documents, copies of statements, and a letter from Marissa's lawyer. She wasn't just trying to apologize anymore. She was threatening to fight me for everything. Alimony, a share of my retirement, even the little money I'd squirreled away in a separate account. Her lawyer claimed she was entitled because of the emotional distress I'd caused by abandoning her. That was the moment the last thread snapped. She not only betrayed me, but now she was trying to turn my survival into her payday. I sat there in that motel room, staring at those papers, and felt something shift, not the hot flash of anger I'd expected, but a deep, cold clarity. I realized then that I wasn't going to beg for anything. I wasn't going to play her game. I was going to fight her, not out of spite, but because I was done being a pawn in someone else's story. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but an old college buddy named Vince, who'd once told me he specialized in messy divorces. I figured if anyone could handle this disaster, it was him. Vince listened quietly as I laid it all out. How Marissa had manipulated me, how she'd covered for Richard, how she was now trying to bleed me dry. When I finished, there was a pause, and then Vince let out a slow whistle. He said he'd seen plenty of divorces, but mine had the perfect storm of betrayal, greed, and bad timing. He agreed to take my case and started outlining steps we could take to protect my assets and push back against her claims. For the first time in weeks, I felt a tiny spark of hope. But that didn't mean it was easy. Every time I signed a paper, every time I read over another list of demands from her side, I felt that same old sickness crawl back up my throat. I'd always thought divorce was just the breaking of a bond, but now I saw it was also a slow bleeding out of everything you thought you'd built together. The legal battles dragged on for months. Marissa tried to play the victim at every turn, painting me as the cold, abandoning husband who'd left her in the lurch. But Vince was good. better than I'd hoped. He found the inconsistencies, the payments Richard had made, the contradictions in her story. Slowly, painfully, we started peeling back the layers of her lies. I started noticing little changes in myself during those months. I wasn't just waiting for a next move or the next court date. I was starting to rebuild quietly in small ways. I picked up an old hobby, woodworking, and started making things with my hands. At first, it was just a way to keep busy, but soon it became a lifeline, something that grounded me when everything else felt unstable. I also reached out to a few old friends I hadn't talked to in years. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who'd been through something like this. One guy, Dave, told me how his ex had drained their savings and skipped town. Another, Ray, confessed that his wife's affair had almost cost him his business. We weren't heroes, just regular men trying to piece things back together after being blindsided. One afternoon, Vince called with a breakthrough. He'd uncovered emails between Marissa and Richard that proved she'd been complicit from the start, that she'd known exactly what was happening and chose to play along. It wasn't the redemption I thought it might be. It was a confirmation that I hadn't just imagined the worst. It was worse than I thought. After Vince's call, I sat in that motel room in Lebanon with the emails spread out in front of me. The cheap wood grain table, the peeling paint on the walls, the buzz of the broken air conditioner, all of it felt like a cruel joke. My whole life reduced to a stack of paper proving that my wife hadn't just lied. She'd actively chosen to destroy me. And for what? A few $1,000s and the chance to play the martyr in front of her friends? I just sat there, staring at those pages until the words blurred and my hands stopped shaking. I realized, with a hollow sort of clarity, that the version of Marissa I'd loved all those years never really existed. She was a fiction, a careful construct of charm and neediness. A person who knew exactly how to keep me tethered to her chaos. I remembered little things, how she used to pout when I was too tired to go out, how she'd make a scene if I didn't text her back fast enough, how she always needed just a little help with the bills, the projects, the social obligations. It was never about partnership. It was always about control. And now, faced with the evidence, I couldn't even muster anger. I just felt used up. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to hide in motels or let her smear my name in court filings. I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story of our marriage, casting herself as the victim and me as the cold, detached husband. No, I would show up to the next hearing. I would bring every document Vince had uncovered. I'd lay it all bare, calmly, methodically, with a voice steady from exhaustion rather than rage. The next morning, I shaved, put on a suit that had seen better days, and drove back to Springfield. I walked into the courthouse with my head high, even though my heart was hammering in my chest. Marissa was there, dressed in a muted gray dress, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She didn't look at me. Her lawyer gave me a thin, practiced smile as if they'd already won. But when the judge asked if there was any new evidence, Vince stood up and handed over the emails. He didn't embellish. He just stated the facts. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, I saw Marissa's face shift, not the careful mask she always wore, but something raw, something panicked. The judge called a recess to review the evidence, and I stepped outside into the bitter spring air. It felt like breathing for the first time in months. That afternoon, the judge returned with a decision that felt like a small mercy. The alimony was denied. The claims against my retirement account were dismissed. Marissa's lawyer tried to protest, but the judge cut him off. The financial trail was too clear, the story too tangled. It wasn't a complete victory. There were still debts to sort out, reputations to mend, but it was the first moment in a long time when I felt like I wasn't drowning. I wish I could say that day was the end of it, that I walked out of that courthouse and never looked back. But life, as it turns out, isn't so tidy. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and awkward encounters with mutual acquaintances who weren't sure which side they were supposed to take. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with thinly veiled judgment, like I'd failed some unwritten test of manhood by not fixing my marriage. I kept my head down, found a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Springfield, a place with creaky floors and ancient plumbing, but a quiet, steady sort of peace. I started working extra hours at my job. Nothing glamorous, just managing logistics for a regional distribution company. But the routine felt like salvation. There was something comforting in the predictability, in a mindless rhythm of numbers and schedules that didn't depend on anyone else's whims. Every so often, Marissa's lawyer would send another letter, some half-hearted attempt to reopen negotiations or discuss terms. Each time, Vince would handle it with the kind of quiet professionalism I didn't think existed outside of TV shows. The call slowed down, then stopped altogether. Marissa had finally realized that the story she'd built was crumbling, and there wasn't enough left to salvage. And yet, even with the legal battles cooling off, I found myself haunted by small, stupid memories. The way her laugh used to fill a room. The scent of her shampoo in the mornings. The way she'd lean into me when she was cold. It wasn't that I wanted her back. God, no. But those fragments clung to me like stubborn cobwebs, remnants of a life I thought was real. One night, about a month after the last court hearing, I sat alone in my apartment, nursing a cheap beer and listening to the creak of the old radiator. And I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. The bitterness had burned itself out, leaving behind something harder, colder, but also strangely freeing. I wasn't her victim. I wasn't the poor, betrayed husband. I was just a man who'd survived a storm and was learning how to live again. It's funny how silence becomes a companion when you've had too much noise. I learned to appreciate it in that apartment. The way the creak of the floorboards or the distant hum of traffic replaced the constant buzz of arguments and accusations. The quiet wasn't empty. It was a space where I could finally hear my own thoughts without her voice weaving through them. A place where I could start to figure out who I was outside of the mess she'd made of us. I started journaling at night, just a few lines about my day or whatever thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. I wasn't writing poetry or anything profound, just scribbles about logistics problems at work, a neighbor's loud TV, the way the sky looked right before a storm. It felt small, but it was mine. And every day, those pages piled up, a quiet record of survival. About 6 weeks after that last hearing, I got a letter in the mail. Not from Marissa, not from her lawyer, but from the garden committee. They'd finally completed their internal audit, and it turned out Richard had been caught red-handed. He confessed to everything, admitted to pressuring Marissa, admitted to the missing funds. They even sent me a formal apology, though it was couched in legal jargon and as impersonal as you might expect. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt like the scales had balanced a little. But all I felt was tired. Tired of the lies, tired of the games, tired of the realization that even when you're right, it doesn't always feel like winning. Still, I tucked the letter into my journal, not as a trophy, but as a marker of what I'd come through. There's a bar on the edge of town, one of those places with a worn wooden sign and a jukebox that only plays country classics. I started stopping there once a week, ordering one beer, and sitting quietly in the corner. The bartender, a woman named Kelly, never asked questions. She just refilled my glass with a knowing nod, like she'd seen plenty of men trying to stitch themselves back together. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in what felt like years, I realized I didn't need to be anyone's husband or savior or victim. I just needed to be Henry, a man sitting quietly in a corner bar, figuring out what came next. The thing about rebuilding yourself is that no one tells you how lonely it's going to be. People assume that once the divorce is finalized, once the legal mess is over, you just snap back into a new version of yourself, ready to take on the world. But that's not how it works. Not in Springfield. Not anywhere. There were days I didn't leave the apartment. Days when the only voices I heard were from the old radio or the occasional delivery driver dropping off groceries. I found comfort in the small rituals. Cooking for one, fixing a squeaky cabinet, folding my laundry just the way I liked. It wasn't about the tasks themselves. It was about reclaiming control, piece by tiny piece. I think the hardest part was realizing how much of myself I'd given up over the years. I let Marissa's moods dictate my own, let her chaos drown out my instincts. I thought being a good husband meant being patient, forgiving, steady, but it also meant I stopped listening to the quiet voice in my gut that told me something was wrong. I started listening again, slowly but surely. One evening, sitting in that little corner bar with my one beer, Kelly slid a slip of paper across the counter. It was a phone number, her handwriting neat and unassuming. "If you ever want to talk," she said quietly, without looking up. I almost laughed, not because I thought it was funny, but because it felt so human. A gesture so simple, so grounded, after months of betrayal and lies. I folded the paper and slipped it into my wallet. I didn't call her right away. Maybe I won't ever. But just knowing there's a number in my wallet, a person who saw me as more than a mess of court papers and heartbreak, made the weight a little lighter. Marissa never contacted me again after the last court hearing. I heard from mutual friends that she left Springfield, maybe moved in with family, or found another city to start over. I don't hate her, not anymore. I don't think about her with anger, just a quiet kind of pity. For her. For the version of me who once thought love was enough. One morning, As the sun cut through the grime of my apartment window, I made a list. Not a legal one, not a list of demands or court dates, just a list of things I wanted to learn. Wood turning, maybe fishing, how to make sourdough bread. Simple things. My things. And for the first time in a long time, the thought of tomorrow didn't make me feel like drowning. It felt like breathing, like starting over, like being free.